So back in the 1940s, I want to say 1949 or so, the state of Kansas, the state legislature in its infinite wisdom, required a loyalty oath of all state employees. And when they passed that loyalty oath, it was in the midst of the Red Scare, in the midst of a time when folks were persecuting those who had slightly different opinions than theirs, and inventing people to persecute when they couldn't find real-life people who had opinions different than theirs.
Anybody who was hired in state government was asked to sign the loyalty oath, which you can look up. The original loyalty oath was a very long, detailed oath.
So the particular text of the loyalty oath that the state adopted included some language like you saw in other states that was designed to persecute particularly folks who had socialist or communist views. But as with those other loyalty oaths, it was so broad, so vague, so unconstitutional that it captured all sorts of protected speech and protected association on top of everything else, right? So it went on for nearly 20 years, intimidating people, creating an environment of fear and harassment, creating an environment that restrained people from being themselves. It wasn't until a group of brave people in Kansas came together in the mid-1960s that anyone actually challenged the legality of that loyalty oath.
We just gathered people in our living room and got into an immediate argument. And I said, well, but we're not all lawyers, and there has to be a role for those of us who aren't lawyers. No. I said, well, what about public education, and what about lobbying, and, all this kind of thing? No, we bring cases.
And some folks came together in the 1960s, including a professor, I believe was at the University of Kansas Medical Center.
Jerry Ehrenreich, who was the one that filed the case on the loyalty oath. The reason he was asked to sign a loyalty oath was because he got a job at the KU Medical Center in Kansas City. And so he was the one that brought the case.
And he filed a lawsuit that eventually succeeded, got the loyalty oath struck down as being unconstitutionally vague. Things can be unconstitutional because they say so little that you don't know what they are intended to cover.
Anybody who wants to overthrow the government of the United States is going to be very willing to lie and sign an oath. So what does an oath give you? And that convinced Wayne there really was no value in a loyalty oath, and it certainly seemed unconstitutional. And that's why he took the case.
But it's a very important thing because it is really the ongoing struggle in this country between a government that wants to tell other people how to live their lives, that wants to infringe on our freedom, and always does so in a way that picks on the same groups of people. And so there was a lot of work to be done. And our charge was really to build a movement of folks all across Kansas, not just in the half a mile away from the office's location, but all over the state, to build a movement of folks who were passionate about civil liberties, willing to do something about it, willing to push back, and willing to build something better, too. And I think that's what we've accomplished.
Annie on My Mind by Nancy Yarden is a book about a same-sex relationship between two young women. The school principal ordered that the book be removed from the bookshelves, and the librarians complied. Then some students contacted the ACLU.
There wasn't a lot of book banning going on like there is now. It was a fairly rare occurrence at that point in time.
The Annie on My Mind case, which was about folks wanting access to literature, wanting access to a story that reminded them of themselves, or wanting access to a new perspective, wanting to find out that that's part of the purpose of literature, is to take you to someplace you have not been before.
And so we offered several times to the school board to dismiss the lawsuit if they would just simply replace the book, and they refused to do so.
It was always hard to get plaintiffs in those cases, with, the exception of the Any on My Mind case.
We had a 5-week trial. All of our students and parents testified. Students were marvelous witnesses, very dedicated.
That was very good for all of those kids to participate in it. I'm glad they did. And if it hadn't been for them, a lot of this wouldn't have happened. I mean, a lot of it was at their urging to get this going, and they wanted us to do something about it.
So then I put on my star witness, which was Nancy Arden.
One of the cool things, the author of the book came to town to help us with this.
She was an absolutely lovely lady, one of the nicest people and smartest that I've ever met.
The Annie on My Mind case is a perfect example of the sentiment that everything old is new again.
Judge Van Beber made a wonderful decision that just clearly laid out the fact that the First Amendment rights of these students had been violated.
Attempting to restrict it is really a way of limiting people's freedom, a way of limiting perspective, a way of stopping us from imagining something different and better.
It showed them that you can get something done and you can go up against the school board.
That's why it was so dangerous then that the school district was trying to restrict access to it. That's why it was so important to win that case. And that's why it's so important that case law like that exists today, because it reminds people that they have tools to use when folks try and ban books, that they have tools to use when people try and shut them down, that they have tools to use when people try and erase them from the American story.
I had wanted to do a same-sex marriage case for a while. They didn't want people in the sticks to do a marriage equality case. They're afraid we lose.
So the important thing to remember about Marie versus Moser is that it happened before Obergefell, which is the United States Supreme Court case that ensured that marriage equality was the law of the land.
It became pretty clear that we might be able to win a case.
To a great extent, our job here in Kansas, that Doug Bonney, the legal director at the time, stewarded, was to say, hey, in other places around this country, the Constitution is being shown to protect the right to marriage equality. Let us make sure that is the law here too. Let us protect those same rights here too.
I loved my plaintiffs in that case. I loved them all. They were such nice people. They were willing to do whatever we needed them to do, show up for the depositions against pretty hostile, frankly, and jerkish assistant attorneys general in that case. And we filed a motion for preliminary injunction and had the hearing in early November of 2014 in front of Judge Crabtree. And he ruled for us. The state immediately filed an emergency appeal with the Supreme Court. And the significance of that case and that part of the case, when it went to the Supreme Court on that emergency motion, is that once that was denied, we knew we were going to win Obergefell.
And the fact that it happened in Kansas, a place that people perceive in a particular way in the national landscape, the fact that it happened when Sam Brownback, who was as hostile to LGBTQ plus equality, as hostile to equal rights as any person who has ever walked this earth, was governor of the state of Kansas. The fact that that happened at that time was an important way of showing to the country what is possible, to show to the entire country that we can protect our rights, we can defend our values, we can affirm freedom and equality in every single jurisdiction in America.
When Kobach was a law professor, he had a side gig where he was peddling his services to right-wing causes. He wrote a law review article about the need to keep non-citizens from voting, and that the way to do this was to have documentary proof of citizenship. And this was going to solve the problem that he contended was massive voting by non-citizens. The Kansas legislature, in a bipartisan fashion, I'm sorry to say, passed his idiotic law.
It had this impact of really making it harder for certain groups of people to be able to register to vote. And there was also the additional issue of it was rolled out in such an expedited way that a lot of people, just didn't have the time to go and get those documents if they had lost them at some point.
Everything about what he has done is consistent. It has been one consistent vision from the day he showed up. And what is also consistent is that it is divorced from the law, contrary to the Constitution, and repellent to the people at large.
January of 2013, I moved here, and coincidentally, that was the year that documentary proof of citizenship, Chris Kobach's sort of signature voter suppression effort, went into place.
The big game was the direct challenge to the documentary proof of citizenship law in a lawsuit called Fish versus Kobach.
Fish was an important case. It challenged Kansas's documentary proof of citizenship requirement in order to register to vote. So many people were disenfranchised as a result of that. And I think one of the problems was, yes, it's burdensome to go and, have to present all this extra information to show you're a citizen in order to register to vote. But a big problem was that people weren't being informed until they showed up to vote that there was something non-compliant or that they had missing information.
In an attempt to preserve this deeply, deeply flawed documentary proof of citizenship papers, please requirement, he attempted entirely on his own to create a two-tiered system of voting where some people would get to vote in federal elections and only federal elections, and everyone else would get to vote in everything else. You don't get to do that, especially in Kansas.
So Fish was just wins across the board. I can't describe it any other way. There was a win at the preliminary injunction stage, which was why the law was enjoined when I first registered to vote in Kansas or re-registered to vote in Kansas. That was appealed to the 10th Circuit. The 10th Circuit said, no, the district court got it right. There was a summary judgment decision saying just about all of the claims could go forward. Then we were successful at trial. And then that success at trial was upheld by the 10th Circuit. There was a petition to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court, even when this was post-RGB Supreme Court, that sent it back and said, no, I think the 10th Circuit and District Court got it right.
We wiped the floor with Chris Kobach.
This was clearly a violation of the National Voter Registration Act. It had the constitutional implications, and it was poorly litigated on the side of the Kansas government.
By the time we got to trial, it was clear he didn't really know what he was doing, especially not in trial.
In what I think was a somewhat unusual move, the Secretary of State's office defended the case on its own without the support of the State Attorney General's office.
In the first appeal in Fish, when we went for oral argument, he was late. He showed up late to the oral argument.
There were times when they would submit briefs with huge errors, with comments still in there. There was also, significant issues when we were at trial. I mean, there were a number of times where Judge Robinson had to explain to Secretary Kobach, this is how you lay the foundation in order to introduce evidence or ask a witness a question. Things that most people... Lawyering 101. Lawyering 101, things most of us learn in law school. Or mock trial, or you mock trial in high school. Very possible you could have learned it before then.
It's this time to mention when he was ordered to go back to class.
Yeah, I was actually, I sat in on the deposition. We got to depose Kobach. Yeah, he got in trouble with the judge.
During the trial on Fish v. Kobach, Judge Julie Robinson, who was appointed to the bench by George W. Bush, was so taken aback by Mr. Kobach's behavior and his apparent lack of knowledge of how legal proceedings are supposed to unfold that she required him to attend a continuing education class on basic trial procedure.
I was happy to be in the audience at the courthouse when the judge told Chris he needed to go take some remedial legal courses. I almost laughed when she said that, but it was a federal court. I mean, we're really embarrassed to do that.
It was sad, I tell you.
In the 2018 Republican primary, there were hundreds of ballots not counted because they said that their signature on their mail ballot didn't match. But they never even tried to contact the voter to ask if that was their signature, if something had happened, like a stroke that had changed their signature to not match. And it was clear that some of them were throwing out votes that should have been counted, and no one could know what was happening because the counties refused to release any information or data about these folks.
Chris Kobach's assault on everything that we hold dear was not limited to just the documentary proof of citizenship case. He went after voting rights in every place he could.
So the first lawsuit for data was in Johnson County, and we won that. And then I tried to request, because we have 105 counties. And so I found out that the Secretary of State's office should have all of this data from all the counties. And so I was like, instead of bothering 105 counties, I'm just going to ask the Secretary of State. But they took the stance that the Johnson County ruling didn't matter and continued to deny access to the data. And that led to the second lawsuit, which was then on a statewide level to, guarantee the right, for transparency and accountability at a statewide level. And we also won that case.
We challenge that because the Constitution is for everybody, not just the chosen few.
Where things get a little wild is there was then a following case, because right after we won access to the statewide data, the Secretary of State's office decided to turn off the ability of their database to produce the report as a way to just try to, fight transparency. And it was so bizarre. We actually went to the appeals court, and then we won in the appeals court, which was the final say, which actually not only was important because it showed a standard of government officials can't try to game the system. They can't try to find a workaround to say, well, it is an open record, but if we play this little game or change the code in our software, then we just don't have to comply with open records. The appeals court ruling made clear that if a record is open, it's open, and the public has a right to see it.
Everything about his vision is something that deserves to be rejected, is being rejected, and will continue to be rejected because it has no basis in the law, in the Constitution, or in what is right and wrong. He hasn't learned that. The rest of us have, though, and that's why we know how to deal with him. That's why we at the ACLU know how to respond to him, and it's why we kick his tail all the time. We should not ever believe for a moment that protecting the right to vote is something that only happens in Washington or something that only happens in Topeka. It's not just about state legislative decisions. It's not just about decisions by the Attorney General or the Secretary of State. In fact, most of what happens in protecting voting rights is at the hyper-local level in a decentralized system of elections where very local officials are the ones making the decisions. It is a reminder that local folks have enormous power, and that if we're really going to defend democracy, if we're really going to build a firewall for freedom in this country, it requires us to do it at the most local of levels. And so one of those stories that we heard at the local level was in Dodge City, Kansas.
LULAC versus Cox was a case that we brought in advance of the 2018 state election. The case, though, centered on one particular community, that was Dodge City, Kansas.
Dodge City, despite being a community of 25,000 people, give or take, only had one polling location for the entire city. In places in Johnson County, and really almost everywhere in the state, there's often one polling location for every 1,000 or 1,500 people, not one per 25,000.
This was something that had been on our radar for a while. But it kind of came back front and center and with some urgency a couple of months in advance of the 2018 general election. And that was because the location where voting typically happened, the typical polling location where everybody came to, was under construction, so it wasn't going to be usable.
Even until now, I think we're still not sure how much the construction was actually this meaningful hindrance to people being able to go vote.
And so she ended up moving she kept stuck with one election site and she moved it outside of town, so outside of the city limits. So that's kind of where they did a lot of like livestock related things. It was out in the country for a reason.
I think the sheer bizarreness, absurdity of moving a poll at the last minute outside the city limits, away from bus routes, a long walk. I think at one point there aren't even sidewalks for people to get there. Across the train tracks, it's like very dramatic.
Bus routes didn't run out there. A lot of people who would be coming from the meatpacking plants, which were, remain one of the largest employers, would have a harder time getting there than they would something that was more centrally located.
And this is something we run into a lot with election officials, with elected officials, with people in these positions who are in charge of a lot, where on paper, like, you're just moving a location to another. And I think there's just not a consideration for what the actual voters' experience is, and just a disconnect between an official's ability to sort of put themselves in the position of someone who is used to going to this one location and now, has to travel so far to get somewhere else. And I think there's just that disconnect and inability to sort of have that first person understanding.
We tried to come in and talk to Clerk Cox about this and said, hey, there's some, in addition to this kind of being bad policy and not helpful for your constituents, there's some legal ramifications for all this as well. Like, this is actually interfering with people's rights to vote under the Constitution.
But I think nationally people saw that Kansans and people in Dodge City were not just going to take it, right? And that the resistance against this, and I think the accountability of against an official or of an official, was robust and meaningful. And I think it also inspired a lot of people to probably look at their own communities and think about, how do I hold my own local officials accountable?
People were becoming aware of the fact that voter suppression is not just police dogs and fire hydrants, but takes many forms, including moving the location. So they were paying attention to that. And just the sheer inanity, the sheer absurdity of having one location for 25,000 people that you then literally move outside of the city limits. Dodge City doesn't have a polling because we move it outside of the city. Was so inane, so absurd, that it highlighted for folks just in a very clear way what was happening.
We kind of wrote her a couple of letters. She, at different points, indicated that she was going to meet with us, but we found out at a later date through a public records request that one of the emails that we sent to her, that I sent to her, that I thought was pretty nice, was forwarded to the state election director, Brian Caskey, and it just said, LOL. There's a lot of different ways you can interpret that, but it was basically like, I'm not doing what these people say, F them, I don't care. It showed a real, I think, indifference to the voting rights of her constituents.
Dodge City really illustrates that comms is here to talk about work, because if we don't talk about what we did, nobody knows about it, right? And so nobody knows who filed the lawsuit, nobody knows why, unless comms is there to talk about it. And I think we did a really good job ensuring that it was in local media, that there was transparency about the whole story, right? We were able to tell the whole story from beginning to end of how we got to this point.
So ultimately, we continued to engage in negotiations up until about 2 weeks before the election. I think at that point, it became clear that there was not going to be any additional polling locations and that the polling location was going to remain outside of town. And so we really felt like that there was nothing else we could do. It was time to file suit.
So Melissa Seiler, our voting rights organizer at the time, and also a big part of how we do county voting work now, in Dodge City, had been in constant communication with folks, at least, almost a year ahead of the actual peak in the Dodge City litigation. So up until that time, she had been in constant communication with them about first what their concerns were in terms of voting access in Ford County and Dodge City. So we knew well before the litigation, probably a year ahead, that there was this one poll in Dodge City that had tens of thousands of voters that were supposed to go vote there on election day somehow. And then we also sort of knew, as Melissa was meeting with folks regularly, talking to them about their concerns, sort of walking them through what it means to engage with public officials. So when they were meeting with Debbie Cox and talking to her about their issues, when there were times that she refused to meet with them, we were sort of aware of all of that along the way for months and months. And so by then, we had a really good understanding of who the affected people were and who the sort of leading voices in Dodge City were and the grassroots leaders of organizing. We sort of had this like built-in cast of characters to join as plaintiffs in the case. And there was almost no search. As far as I know, it was more, do you want to be a plaintiff after you've done all this so far? And for the clients, it was, yeah, I've been working on this issue for a year and I have not had any positive results. So obviously, yeah, let's go. I want to be part of the case.
And so we filed a TRO and a preliminary injunction motion to basically requiring, our request was that the county would have to create additional polling locations, that they'd have to be accessible. That was the ask. One of the issues with the case was that it was so close to the election that the county could kind of put up this legitimate, plausible argument that it would be too confusing to tell people where to vote if there were to be new locations introduced. Now, I don't think it was that plausible because at the end of the day, they had just picked the expo center. They were just now publicizing it. They could have very easily gotten information out to other people about additional polling locations. And people want to vote, right? People do want to vote. I believe that in my soul, that people want to vote.
The clients and the activists that we work with become also part of the integrated advocacy work. So to them now, they see that similar to how we use field and policy and legal as these different levers of power, they sort of realize too that, okay, as a resident of Dodge City who is a voter and who's concerned about this, I've done the advocacy, directly with the official. I've done the organizing with my community. And now the next point of escalation is litigation, and I can also show up as part of that too.
So we ended up not winning the TRO, preliminary injunction. Judge Crabtree was our judge in that case. And, he, I think, did do us a little bit of a service in saying, hey, it's too late, it's too close to the election to be able to enter the injunction that the plaintiffs have requested. But I'm concerned about this woman. She's out here writing lull in emails. Like, she's had one polling location despite all the evidence that we saw in this hearing that people want more. So he's like, this case is not going anywhere. I just can't make a decision for in advance of this election.
I think it's just put on the map that county clerks manage elections in a lot of counties in Kansas in a way that I think people really didn't realize.
Unfortunately, the election went forward with just the one location that was out of town.
But I think nationally people saw that Kansans and people in Dodge City were not just going to take it.
And I think that there was just incredible outpouring of support from kind of around the country.
We were inundated with calls here at the ACLU of Kansas with people wanting to help, wanting to find ways to work around what Debbie Cox was doing.
That was like the flood of calls was so many people suggested buses, and we just didn't have the capacity to organize that.
And then Lauren had this lightning bolt thought. I wonder, Lauren thought, what they're paying lawyers while they're resisting us.
And I was a little embarrassed because as a journalist, I should have thought of that first. You always follow the money.
And so Katie started digging into the receipts. Katie Moore, who I think now works for the Marshall Project.
Yep.
And it turned out that the election official had spent more on legal defense, resisting what her constituents wanted, than it would have cost to move those precincts downtown.
It was one of those cases where we didn't get this great order, changing the law necessarily or forcing the clerk to do something differently. But the litigation was this huge push to make a change happen. And ultimately she wanted to be out. She wanted to not be a defendant in the case bad enough that she did what the community had been asking.
It was one of the most wonderful experiences I've had in my professional life, seeing something like that happen. And it all happened when we started driving toward the truth, and we found out the truth was this person was spending more money resisting what her constituents wanted than it would have taken to establish 5 or 10 voting precincts.
We were able to enter into an agreement with her and to reach a negotiated agreement that there would be more polling locations in the future. They would be more geographically dispersed, and that folks would have greater access to the ballot as a result. And that has held true to this day.
So I joined the affiliate a few months after litigation had been filed in the Kansas Supreme Court that was attempting to decarcerate Kansas jails in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And unfortunately, that litigation effort was not successful at the Kansas Supreme Court. So the affiliate was at this juncture of needing to decide, what do we do next? We don't want to leave this issue behind, but how do we use the legal tools that are at our disposal to actually try to help some of the people who are currently incarcerated and whose health and safety was at risk?
The Clemency Project was a very unusual project of the ACLU of Kansas in that it was taking on individual criminal cases in a way and then sort of shifting them to the executive mechanism that would allow them to get out of prison early.
So the affiliate came up with the idea through sort of the ingenuity of our then paralegal, now ACLU of Kansas communications director, to identify a large number of clients and work with them to file clemency petitions on their behalf, basically to ask the governor to exercise the power she has in the executive branch to let these people out before the end of their sentence.
We had several clients that had pretty significant medical issues that would leave them vulnerable to complications or death from COVID-19.
So the affiliate worked to identify potential plaintiffs and potential people who could serve as clients for the Clemency Project, and then dived into their applications, helped them complete their applications, and in the end, managed to submit over 100 clemency petitions to Governor Kelly.
And at that point, we'd also had, after people sort of saw that we had filed this lawsuit and were clearly concerned and looking for solutions to COVID in prisons, we had already had so many calls and emails about, hey, what about my loved one? And so people were obviously really worried. And so then we started expanding from the core clients to, okay, folks who had reached out to us. And that's went quickly from 5 to 10 to ultimately 108 applications that, I filled out and filed. And, that included calls with the family and compiling statements and history. We sort of got their whole story, right? Like, this wasn't just a form. We attached an entire story of the person that we were applying for.
Governors in Kansas typically, if they use the clemency power at all, are using it in their second term of office, at the end of their second term of office, and maybe for a small number of individuals.
There had already been some mass commutations in other states. I think Oklahoma's governor granted a lot of people who were sentenced to drug crimes, minor drug crimes, clemency or commutations. And so we sort of knew that in other states there were governors that were starting to see clemency as this sort of last resort to correct injustice in the system. And so we thought, okay, now's the time in Kansas.
Through this coordinated campaign, which involved direct representation and communications work, broader education of the public, and political pressure, Governor Kelly used the clemency power for a larger number of individuals in her first term than had ever been used by a first-term Kansas governor in the past. And what that meant was that some of our clients got to spend
precious months at home with their families and have their health and safety protected.
There was one person, one of our clients, that we had applied to the governor for clemency for. This guy, Christopher McIntyre, was suffering from cancer. His family, because he was in prison, they didn't have a whole lot of contact with him. And apparently he'd been following. This affiliate filed somewhere in the neighborhood of 108 clemency applications. But Christopher's in particular was important to me.
He got those last few months with his family. I don't think we can discount what it means to be able to be with your family in your last days. And for his sister, Alicia, to be able to connect with him again. We alone probably set a record of how many applications they got. But I know on top of that, it just became too much. And so we developed a toolkit. So after about 100, you sort of feel like ready to tell people how to do something. We were able to develop this toolkit that just walked people through, because you don't need a lawyer to represent you to apply for clemency. And I think really demystified the whole process. And I think I had heard at one point, and I believe it was from the governor's office, that there were 200 applications that they had received by then. And they were even considering hiring an additional staff in the governor's office to review applications for clemency. We absolutely wanted each of those 108 applications and the people that we represented to get freedom. But on top of that too, this sort of concept of saying hundreds of people are worthy of a second chance right now is an idea that, but for us bringing it up, may not have, been, Governor Kelly may not have had otherwise.
Shaw was this case that we started with a couple of intakes and a dream.
So one of the first cases that I worked on as an attorney and then as a legal director at the affiliate was the case against the Kansas Highway Patrol. So it's a case called Shaw v. Jones, and it was actually on behalf originally of 3 individuals who had been involved in 2 separate traffic stops on Kansas highways by members of the Kansas Highway Patrol, the KHP.
What happened with Shaw, though, was we got these really consistent stories from just 2 people, but we got these 2 really consistent stories of someone being stopped by a Kansas Highway Patrol officer in western Kansas when they were coming back or going to Colorado. And what happened was they were, pulled over for kind of a traffic infraction. The officer would ask for consent to search their vehicle. They would say no. Then they'd say, if you say no, I have to bring a dog out. And then they would say, I'm still saying no. And then they'd bring a dog out. And it was this big, long detention. And I feel like it was the same dog for both of our clients. That dog was a menace. He was named in a lot of stuff.
Police officers need something called reasonable suspicion in order to detain a motorist for longer than it takes to just complete the traffic stop, right? A normal traffic stop includes giving over your license and registration. The officer then runs those, makes sure there's no outstanding warrants. They write you up a traffic ticket, or they write you up a warning. They come back to the window, they give you that paperwork, and you should be free to go. But what was happening in these stops is that the officers were then trying to engage the drivers in additional questions with the goal of detaining them, calling out a canine dog to sniff around the car, and eventually searching their car for drugs. They were doing that without adequate reasonable suspicion, without any real evidence to point to that a crime had been committed or was about to be committed. And that violated the Constitution.
It wasn't something that was really obviously a institutional problem, but we thought it was similar enough what had happened to them to start doing some digging. Zal and I started making requests to the Highway Patrol. We also, just for their policies and their trainings, just kind of general Kansas Open Records request. We also reached out to the public defender's offices that were along I-70 because we were like, there's something about this road, the main, highway in the state. And the more we heard, they're like, oh, well, there's these 2 people who complained to us, but there's a lot of people who have won suppression hearings based on this tactic in the defense, in their criminal defense cases. And then also just the criminal defense attorneys we were talking to, like, oh yeah, that's a huge problem, they do this. And then also we looked at their training and we're like, oh, they trained them to do this thing.
Shaw was a really strong case that we were able to bring because people had come to us first about what had happened to them.
One of the more interesting things about this case from an investigation perspective was that as soon as we filed it and news got out that this litigation was happening, we started hearing from people all over the country who had driven through Kansas and had this exact same thing happen to them, which showed just how widespread the practice had been.
It was a case that was really impactful. It impacted every single, not only Kansans, but people who were just traveling through.
What the case found and what the investigation around the case found was that KHP officers were trained to engage in what they called the Kansas two-step, which was a maneuver where they handed the paperwork back at the end of the traffic stop, took 2 steps away from the vehicle, and then immediately reapproached the driver and said something to the effect of, hey, can I ask you a couple more questions? The driver at that point thinks they're just still being detained and that they have to keep answering these questions. The KHP officer thinks that this has now become a consensual encounter. And what our investigation and litigation in the case showed is that these drivers didn't feel free to leave. And in fact, they couldn't pull back into traffic on an interstate with a KHP officer standing right at their window again. They felt pressured into answering these questions, and the whole operation was just in an attempt to violate these drivers' constitutional rights and get them to give up information so that the officer could get inside their car and search for drugs. And that violated the Constitution, and that's what a federal district court in Kansas found.
I think the two-step also, the two-step in this sort of lip service to consensual interaction, it just sort of shows to me there's like a lack of seriousness to that. Is you don't actually, there's no way that you as a human believe this. Maybe as a officer of the law, you sort of are, I think there's a very blatant unseriousness, insincerity to that entire concept. And they built an entire training program from that.
I think at first the court was skeptical of our claim, and maybe for good reason. There does seem to be quite a bit of deference to law enforcement to make sure that they can do their job safely and effectively. But once we were able to put on the testimony of our clients and of experts and of KHP officers themselves, I think it became very clear to the court that this was a very elaborate ruse being run by the Kansas Highway Patrol, and that they were deliberately violating previous law written by the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in order to get access to motorists' cars.
In our research, as we were putting things together, we knew that the Kansas Highway Patrol had been sued for this in the past. Not the whole agency, but one individual officer, Vasquez, yeah. And so that was another thing that I think drove us a little bit, was like, your officers have gotten in trouble for this in the past. You set wonderful 10th Circuit precedent for everybody, for people like me, but, and you're still doing it. And there was, I think, a real insistence and a resistance on the part of the state that, like, we should be able to do interdiction work in this way, even if it violates people's rights. And I think that, like, that was one of the things. This was a clearly established violation, and they kept going. And then we sued again, and we were winning on all these motions, and they kept going. And so that was disappointing for me as a Kansan who would like to believe in my governor.
We were able to win and obtain an order from that court prohibiting this practice going forward.
A lot of people said that, like, I used to really trust law enforcement, but this was so obviously unfair that I just can't, it changed their perspective of law enforcement forever.
They were very courageous people, and it was really obvious that the whole experience had really damaged them emotionally, to where they didn't want to ever come back to the state of Kansas again.
Yeah.
But they came back for this trial. They stood up and did what they needed to do, which is a really brave thing that they did. And it's a brave thing for any of our plaintiffs to get up and do that.
There's a very well-structured list of things you have to do to keep an organization going. And I said, well, but we're not all lawyers, and there has to be a role for those of us who aren't lawyers. No. Well, what about public education, and what about lobbying, and, all those kind of things?
So one of the wonderful things about the ACLU is that we have multiple tools to use. Folks often think of us from our past as a litigation shop, and it is certainly true that we sue people. We enjoy doing it. We sue people who need suing, and will continue to do so. But not everything is suable. Not everything is legislatable. Not everything is organizable. We have to use the tool that the moment demands. What's great about the ACLU is we have developed additional tools. We've added on to our litigation with communications and policy and organizing and political work. And all of those things mean that whatever the moment demands, we are able to rise to it.
When I came to the ACLU of Kansas, I had worked in a few different legal environments before that, but each of those environments had been one discrete mode of lawyering. When I came to the ACLU, it was the first time I learned how to integrate lots of different ways of attacking an issue and put them together into a cohesive plan that did not rely on one institution or one group of people to uphold rights.
I'm a lifelong Kansan, and I'm queer and trans, and I went to law school largely to do queer and trans advocacy in the state. And I just viewed the ACLU of Kansas as like a really great landing spot for me to be able to do that work because of our integrated advocacy model. It was super flexible for me to be engaged in the community, be engaged in a policy space, and then also identify like big needs that we had that we could take to the courts to address these issues in a systemic way.
If we end up in the situation where we've got something really bad that we need to confront, then we can go to the courts. The courts are not seen as the place of first resort. They're seen as a backstop. But that's really the function and role courts should have in our democracy.
It's not just comms. It's what the affiliate did in terms of integrated advocacy that also made it. It's, fighting on these different fronts until that front collapses under the weight of it.
We're never operating on one level only. There is a concerted effort to think about how do we get at this from an organizing perspective? How do we get at this from a policy advocacy perspective? How do we educate the public so that they can go advocate to their elected representatives to take a stand on these issues?
Our strongest litigation work comes from movement lawyering, comes from a meaningful engagement with the community and the development of those relationships, because on paper, you can pull any legal theory out and have a very strong, theory of a case of a rights issue to bring up. But if you don't have anyone to sort of stand up and say, yes, this affected me, then you don't really have a case. You just have a legal theory.
I think one of the things about integrated advocacy and litigation as part of it is that I think it made sure that a lot of our work was really driven by community concerns and community priorities. I think having such a strong, robust, and I think innovative field team, at least when I was here, really made that possible.
If you don't know what's happening with people in their real lives on the ground and different experiences, then you don't know what you're really trying to change. Because I think a lot of people will, particularly like in the academic world, will think they have this great solution, this theoretical solution, but that doesn't actually match up with what a community is actually experiencing. And in fact, it can be harmful.
We need that backing of litigation behind us to say we mean business about this. And it showed our young people that they're not out here windmilling and swinging by themselves. Not only were they learning how to connect and build with community and organize, they were also being taught how this litigation works and the steps that it takes to build a strong backing behind policies that you want to change.
And theoretically, the reason that the legal system was developed was to help us sort of impose order and make lives better for people who are living in a society together. And so I think that's why we're here, right? Is to ensure that law is not just an end in itself, but that it is actually used as a tool to make life better for folks.
We're a small affiliate. There is not a robust civil rights community here. We all have to kind of be on the same page and work together. And I think that so even when we weren't winning lawsuits, we were winning the war, right? And you can't do that when you're not integrated.
I think that organizing is so important because it's about bringing people into the cause and giving them not like being their voice, helping them develop their own voice to engage in the work.
I even think it made all of our work so much more impactful.
No matter what the moment calls for, we have something that we can bring to bear there in partnership with others, in partnership with communities. We have something that can address it. The worst thing would be to have a moment, to have a deep and debilitating attack on our rights and be forced to sit on our hands because we just don't do that here. No, at the ACLU of Kansas, we do that here. No matter what it is, we do that here. We will rise to the moment and we will make sure that liberty is defended.
Another thing that the ACLU of Kansas has done particularly well is build coalitions with different organizations and different people, and sometimes with unexpected partners.
So much of what the ACLU of Kansas's role in these coalitions is being, I think, a grounding voice of what's possible and also being creative.
We were doing a lot of local level work as we continue to do today.
Collaboration is everything because we can't do it all alone.
But I still think that the role of community with the organization kind of plays an even bigger part as the organization is evolving.
I think partnering is very powerful.
The unique integrated advocacy model that we have as one of the bigger organizations doing this work in the state is we have this sort of bird's eye view of legal, policy, comms, field strategies, but also how those overlap and interact and the different levers you can pull at different times.
I think one of the big changes from the work that I've seen change throughout the course of history, especially for El Centro, and I'm sure maybe the ACLU could relate to this, is the alliances. Before, it was pretty much grassroots, as in it was people power. But now we've actually started developing some corporation power, some agency power, some foundation power, which is important because it means that other people are investing in the things that we have known are important for 50 years, 60 years. But others have now started saying no, that everybody does have a seat at the table, having to say what's right and what's wrong.
Even in those early years, the ACLU was such a strong partner. And I think my experience has always really looked at partnering, not just in a transactional way, but really how we can lift each other up and for the mission and for the movement and the cause. That just always felt like, okay, we're not alone. You're right.
A lot of us who are in the trenches, like the folks at what was then a pretty small team at the ACLU, we all were in the trenches together and collaborated. And what's been really, I think, unique, and I know it's unique talking to other people in the country, is that in many states, there's sort of a turf war where everyone has their area and everyone else in the area is a threat. But it's not like that at all in Kansas.
There's different coalitions that coalesce around different things. ACLU and Keefe have worked together on voting rights. We work together on LGBTQ rights. We work together on criminal justice reform.
Because of the coalition that we had created, kind of engaging in policy work on queer and trans issues, we were able to get a lawsuit together really quickly with a great handful of plaintiffs, trans folks that live all throughout Kansas to challenge the anti-trans policies that were in place because of that law.
So we partner with organizations that have the strength that we don't have, that we lack as AIR, because we're such a small team. AIR is really good at the grassroots organizing, right? We can get people to do things because we built the relationships for so long and we put a lot of emphasis on the organizing, and we're missing a lot of the aspects of that ACLU of Kansas has.
My first really dipping my toe into the space of activism with KBLC and ACLU probably was in 2022 with the redistricting. That was the first all hands on deck kind of fight that I was involved with. And to your point, it was the ACLU, it was the League of Women Voters, it was KBLC, it was Mainstream Coalition, it was Loud Light. So there were a lot of organizations that worked together, but then obviously having the legal background and the legal backbone of ACLU, because like KBLC, we're not lawyers, right? We don't, but to have the ACLU to have that legal, when they actually does come to the point of needing litigation, it's helpful to have them around.
We have such great needs here and so little infrastructure that all of us, we have to collaborate. And out of necessity, we collaborate, but also we bring a sincerity to it that I haven't really seen in other states. When people come in from out of state who work in, the nonprofit, the advocacy sphere, they're always surprised at how all of the organizations here, we're recommending each other, we collaborate. A lot of us are in coalition calls every week during session with each other. And that spirit is critical because there is so much more to do here in Kansas than any one org could ever do.
So, Kansas is very unique, and we have to approach it, I think, in a different way than a lot of states. And it's because of the geography, because we are so spread out, but also because people are fiercely independent. Kansans are fiercely independent, and they'll show up if they're asked.
It's that bridge building and community building that the affiliate can do that I think situates itself really well to be a powerful force in the state.
It's not about name recognition here in Kansas. It's not about who does the thing that gets us where we need to be. It's about how do we together do the things that we need to do to get Kansas where it needs to be.
And so on a personal level, it's nice to be a part of a coalition of people with whom you have a lot of beliefs in common. They're fighting a righteous fight over here. They recognize the righteous fight you're engaged in here. And we were there supporting each other. And sometimes we were fighting side by side on the same issue. And others, they were supporting us, and others, I was supporting them.
And the partnerships that grew out of that coalition, the people that we're still working with, even now through different, whether it's language access or just what's happening in the administration, that work continues and those bonds were built. And that's something that I think all of the organizations will take. And that's why we will continue to work with ACLU, because those bonds were, we were kind of in the trenches working hard with community to get those things done. So it kind of gives you also that things are possible. They're not going to be fast. It's not going to be easy, but you have to keep at it.
So much of Kansas's legacy of resistance has been about coalition.
Solidarity, but solidarity in action. So it's like really not just saying we're here for you, but really we'll put our resources to work for the organization that you work for AIR, for the community, for immigration.
Here's all of this information and research we have, and you sort of give it to all of these groups doing amazing work across the state and who have the really deep relationships in those local communities, and giving them this and like arming them with these incredible tools. And then I just love the idea of this, like seeing it sort of spread across the state, right? And thinking about how our work is sort of reaching into different corners in a way that, if we were to do on our own, would not have the same impact.
We have our eyes set on what we want the world to look like, and we can't do it alone. And so it's not about the individual, it's not about me, it's not about people who work at the organization, it's about the wider community. And I think we're really set on that idea.
The difference between 10 years ago and now is profound.
Right now, we're in the middle of a retrenchment, not unlike the end of Reconstruction, where people are having their history, their jobs, their lives threatened.
We realized after the 24 election that people needed to know that they weren't alone. that people needed to feel part of the community.
My first year at the ACLU was in 2023, and that was, I think, the worst year we had seen up to that point for anti-trans legislation being introduced.
As a Jewish person, I know that the first people they go after are the weaker people, the people who have less support, the people who are smaller population. And then they expand that out.
It is really the ongoing struggle in this country between a government that wants to tell other people how to live their lives, that wants to infringe on our freedom, and always does so in a way that picks on the same groups of people.
I mean, look at what's going on. I mean, people being fired from TV shows. I mean, when was it's back to the McCarthy era that some of us remember very well.
Because as you're talking about all this exceptionalism, what it really means, except for them, these people over here on the side, bearing all the scars of this country's worst impulses.
There's no compelling state interest in the state going after trans people. There's nothing that the state is going to get aside from ginning up their base or whatever.
That was true with the loyalty oath in 1949 and 1967, and it's true with government today.
It's like human rights right now. We're literally fighting for our lives to keep the rights that we have and expand things to become better for the better world.
We need more kindness and empathy in this world, and frankly, we need more of a sense of history, not nostalgia.
I've really been quite surprised at the number of book bannings that have occurred since cases like Annie on My Mind.
Nostalgia is really in the way of this society moving forward in the ways that it needs to.
It's frustrating to see these things, history sort of repeat itself, but it's also nice to be able to look back at what our elders did and what our communities came together to achieve, in the context of queer liberation and how much we've accomplished from 1960 to now, and to see that, that same type of thing can happen with trans rights work that's going on today.
You go to a rally or you try to support good causes or donate to candidates, and it can still feel like it's not enough. Yeah. So I feel hopeful being part of a larger network of people and knowing that I'm not alone.
It's about finding where's my little piece. So once people have more rights and more protections and are civically engaged and are voting, that improves schools, that improves the health system, that makes people want to, they make more money, so now they're spending more money. It improves everything. Everybody wins at the end. It's just having the vision.
And I think the ACLU does a really good job of celebrating the wins because we need that to sustain ourselves, whether we're volunteers, donors, or at the front line as staff members.
I think these are all things that we can articulate in a way that resonates with people, because the anti-moral thing that's coming from the right, you really have to twist your mind to kind of think of it as moral. Everybody has those values. Everybody has learned those values. It's in the culture.
We will always be on the good side of history, no matter how much they try to rewrite it.
It's a very poignant time right now, and it's going to determine who's going to be brave and who's going to kind of give in or give up.
I like to be a part of organizations and movements that are actually trying to run at problems as opposed to dodge them or run away from them.
When a new group of people actually gets those rights upheld, there's always this pushback. And so it's frustrating to see the cycle always continue, but it's also nice to look at history and know these things can be won, these battles, have happened before, and we've come out on the other side, a stronger, better, country, stronger, better communities.
The ACLU of Kansas have been around for 60 years. That's 60 years of necessary work.
There's power in these days because of that work that went on 100 years ago. And being able to say, I'm from the ACLU.
That intergenerational work, the knowledge that you attained for 60 years, and us being somewhat new and pulling from what you guys have learned and setting the blueprint for us to continue to move in this work alongside of you guys and build and grow, hopefully we'll be around for 60 years too.
That is why it is so important when groups come together, like a brave group of people in a little living room in Kansas in 1967. That's what changed the world then. That's what changes the world now.